All right. So hello again, everybody. Hope you had a good break. Our next invited speaker is Professor Joydeep Bhattacharya from Goldsmiths, University of London, United Kingdom, where he leads the departmental research group of cognitive and neuroscience and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and Association for Psychological Science, as well as a member of the research group of Science of the Creative and Performing Arts. Joy is very interested in the functioning of the human brain and has a diverse range of research, including music cognition, creativity, and emotion. He has many publications and received a variety of grants, including some from organizations like Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, EPSRC, and Japan Science and Technology Agency, both extremely prestigious societies for funding, as well as his research findings being featured in numerous media outlets such as BBC, ITV, and The Guardian. Thanks a lot, Joy.
Okay, so let me unmute. Yeah, thank you, Amir, very much for your kind introductions, and also thanks a lot for organizing this conference. And I understand it's a big challenge, kind of converting everything to online. But you and the other organizers, you as well as Andrea, as well as other organizers, kind of doing a splendid job. Anyway, so today, yes, I will talk about a slightly different from the previous kind of lectures, although these are all quite tightly interlinked. Hopefully the link would be clear very soon. So the title of my talk is How Music Influences Decision, and primarily I'll touch upon only from the investigations from the cross-modal perspective. And human beings, we actually make decisions at every step in our life, every day and throughout every day. And well, some of the decisions are actually quite mundane, and also some of the decisions can have quite a...
Sorry for interrupting. I think you need to share your screen.
Ah, have I done that? Sorry. See, there you go. A moment. Others, this will stop. Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Okay, moment. I thought I already did. Okay, moment. Share computer sound. Share. Okay.
Yes, fantastic.
Is it all right now? Is all right?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks once again. So now you can see, even after attending a one-day full conference, I'm still messing it up. So how difficult it is, especially for the organizers, to keep a tab on all this messy speaker. So anyway, so thanks once again. And as I said, we humans, we are not the only one, but we make decisions every step in our life. And usually from economic perspective, the decision making is often considered as quite irrational, because there we are modeled as a rational agent, where when there are multiple options are presented, when you have to choose one option, then we often ascribe a certain utility values for each option. And then the model dictates that we choose the option. That means we decide a particular option if it has the highest utility values. So in a sense, we do this kind of cost benefit analysis implicitly. And that leads to this term that we can be coined as a Homo economicus, originally introduced by this concept John Stuart Mills, but the term, if I remember correctly, was first coined by Pareto, this Italian economist who is also famous for Pareto distribution. So this model, that model of assuming that human beings are a rational agent in terms of making decisions, that drives the field of economists almost over 70 or 80 years. However, from the last 30 or odd years, and there has been more and more research coming out, which goes very much against these foundations of economic theories, and that's called the fall of the rational theory. And what are the reasons behind this counter evidence that we, although rationality is a big part in our actions, in our thinking there, and also because we are in all the animal creatures, we definitely have the most evolved prefrontal cortex, which usually engage with the rational thinking. However, we do not analyze in a very cold way, because emotions are intricately coupled in our decision making. So one hand, the Homo economicus theory dictates that we make irrational decisions, where the decisions are primarily guided by maximizing utility. On the other hand, Homo immunalis theory, it suggests that yes, we are actually animals who have tons and hundreds of biases. Many of the biases are often emotional in nature, and these biases cloud and influence our thinking, including decision making. So this kind of transfer of paradigm shift from Homo economicus to Homo emotionalis, so that here the tenet is humans are governed by emotions, and our emotional responses guide our judgment and decision making. And there are already 2 Nobel Prizes been given, which is, you possibly know this kind of famous only living psychologist who got the Nobel Prize, the Dan Kahneman, and then later on Richard Thaler, who are one of the kind of 2 founding fathers of the field, behavioral economics. So what are the underlying psychological and neural mechanisms? So one very influential mechanism proposed by Antonio Damasio, which was popularized in his book, which also became international bestseller. So he introduced the concept of somatic marker hypothesis. So there he kind of discussed what are the somatic markers. Somatic markers are the feelings that are generated in the body that are often associated with emotions, and these somatic markers that directly influence our reasoning and decision making, and most of these influences happen under the radar of our conscious awareness. And another one which is related concept, but which was proposed by the psychologists, primarily social psychologists, they call using affect as information. So when we make a decisions, and often one of the critical input that you use about making a decisions in how we feel at that moment there. So in a sense of affective cues of mood and emotion that influence judgment directly by serving either as experiential and bodily information regarding how one feels about it. So we do not make a decision based on proper deliberations. So we often make a decision based on how we feel about it. These feelings, this using emotional and affective cue that guide and shape our decision making. And that's related with another concept called effect infusion model, which is essentially very similar. Here it makes a much more clear predictions that whenever the cognitive processing has become quite effortful, or also whenever we are confronted with ambiguous informations, when there is no clear conspicuous cue favoring one option over another, in those circumstances, then our current emotional state or current mood state determines what or how we make that decision. So in a sense, this paradigm shift from human as a rational being to human is a very much driven by emotions that kind of squarely point out that cognition and emotion, they are not 2 isolated components. In fact, they are heavily interlinked. So we cannot talk about cognition as a cold analysis or cold thinking. In fact, this emotion, which is often sometimes used, this hot thinking. So this hot aspect means emotions and cognitions are quietly interlinked with each other. And then the moment we bring the emotion into our thinking and decision making, then naturally we cannot exclude music. Because as far as human being is concerned, that the music is often considered one of the most robust, consistent stimulus that stirs us, that moves us, that creates emotion, that puts creates mood, and it was acknowledged many centuries back. For example, there is a quote by Thomas More in the Utopia, and I believe I don't need to sell that means to this crowd that the music and emotion are quite intricately interlinked. Actually, it was very nicely also discussed and presented by the previous talk by the Stefan as well, very nicely given the neural foundation. And importantly, also there has been quite a body of research which suggests that there is a certain universal aspect of the musical emotion. So in a sense, for example, young children, they also can extract emotional intentions from the music. For example, newborn infants prefer consonants over dissonance, or for example, by actually 9 months, these young children, they can discriminate between happy and the sad music. By 3 years, they recognize the happiness, young kind of preschoolers, the happiness in elaborate art music of own culture. And by 6 years, the children's performance is almost like adults. So this gives rise to the suggestion that the propensity, that our biological propensity to respond emotionally to music may be innate, and that gives rise to the potential biological foundations of the music, which is quite hotly debated. And also importantly, just previous speaker and very nicely shown that there are certain music conveys basic emotions across cultures. Yeah, because there is a considerable body of literature which shows that the visual, the kind of facial emotions, which are the visible kind of visual cues that are usually recognized across culture, representing the universality of the visual emotions. In a kind of very similarly, the musical basic emotions conveyed by the basic music and the basic emotions conveyed by the music can also be recognized across culture. For example, Stephens published quite a few years back that indeed the basic emotions, more predominantly the kind of positive emotions that are recognized across culture. However, there are certain still controversies, and also very recently there are actually some studies suggest that not just the emotions, but also the social purpose of the music is also recognized across cultures. And also this is just this kind of a slide actually Stefan showed in his lecture, beautifully illustrating that how music taps all the key emotional networks in the brain. So to be honest, there is no other stimulus other than the music which can tap all these core emotional components, core emotional circuits in the brain. So in a sense, yes, if you want to study the emotional processing, the way we process emotions, definitely music is a wonderful stimuli that can tap the whole complex spectrum of the phenomenological emotional experience that we all experience. Okay, so this is kind of no doubt that the music and the emotions, they're quietly interlinked. And actually there is considerable body of evidence suggest that often one of the most cited or most reported reason to listening to music for so many hours in a day, that we invest so much time of our life, it's primarily to regulate our mood and the emotions. So in a sense, yes, if this link is clearly established, and then earlier I showed humans are, our thinkings and our decisions are also governed by the emotions. So then question is what the data suggests, how the music induced emotions and the music induced mood that might impact on our decision making. So actually one of the first studies coming from the completely different domain, which is in the advertising. So here, one of the classic, quite highly cited studies, which shows that when a product paired with a music that is liked, that product is more favored when the same product is paired with a disliked piece of music. So remember, here in this case, the music is just creating the context in terms of increasing the preference there. But just pairing a product with a light music increases the subjective preference towards that particular product, which can be explained in the psychological terms by classical conditioning approach. There is another related theory, which is called elaboration likelihood modeling approach, which also shows that when, for example, light music is usually more persuasive in terms of increasing our preference for a product, again for advertisements, especially when we do not have any clear high involvement with that particular product. So now that goes back to the earlier, this effect as informations theory and also effect as infusions, because when we do not have a very clear subjective preference towards a particular product, then the background music, or then the music that has been paired with that product, then it becomes more important to sway our persuasion, sway our preference towards that particular product. And music also shown to prime relevant belief about the product during the deliberation phase. So in a sense, the music increases the fitness of the product, this fitness as can be explained in the mental schemata, in the mental representations. So there's a very nice field study, which is also quite highly cited, how the music increases the fitness to the products. So here what the authors actually studied, this is a field study which showing that the y-axis is actually how many bottles of wine actually the consumers bought in a certain period from a supermarket there. So there are two types of wine, the French wine and the German wine. And there were manipulations in one period, the supermarket playing the French music, another period supermarket was playing the background and with the background the German music there. And then you can see there is quite a strong congruency effect. So when the French music was played at the background, then the number of bottles that are purchased in that period is substantially higher when, for example, the German music was played at the background. And also similarly, when the kind of purchase of the German wine was significantly more when, actually kind of during that period when at the background German folk music was being played. And importantly, you have to remember, so when you go to the supermarket, you do not pay attention to what is going on in the background. And it's the same here. So at the time, after the purchase, when the participants or consumers were asked, do they remember anything about the music? They said, no, they have no recollections and they are not consciously aware what kind of music at the background. So in a sense, this suggests that this influence of the background music is very much likely to occur under our level of conscious awareness. So background music also shown to influence our purchase occasion. This is another field study. So this is actually this is a study done at a greetings card store. So on the y-axis, this is shown that what are the purchase intentions when the consumer bought just a neutral greetings card. And they were asked for what occasion they want to use that greetings card, which has no message. And again, unbeknownst to the participants, in some time in the store, they are playing happy music and sometimes they are playing the sad music. And interestingly, what the background music was played at the time of purchase, that influences the purchase intention. The participant says, oh, okay, I want to use this card more likely in the future for happy occasions, especially when the music at the background in the store was more positive and valence. So music also shows, to activate the knowledges which are often quite congruent with the fitness of the product. For example, store attitudes are found to be much more favorable. For example, this is in a perfume store when the music and the perfume are congruent. Or also music could influence the overall attitude of a consumers about the store. Or the last one, which I also like it, another quite interesting field study, that it was done in a cafeteria. So depending on what the background music was played at the cafeteria, the consumers left more tips. So the similar environment, but at least they found that when the classical music was playing more classical music, then the customers left more tips. And there are potential kind of reasons why that is the case. So in a sense, there has been quite a bit of literature showing that when participants are led to a specific mood induction specifically by using music, because music is a very powerful tool to induce a specific mood, and that had a very significant and consistent effect on their particular decisions or particular tasks in different cognitive domains. For example, mood induced by happy music, usually participants make more false detection of faces in noise. So that's interesting. So when, you are presented a noises, there is no face there, but participants are more likely to report seeing more faces, although there is no faces, especially when they're in a more of a positive or happy mood. Similarly, the participants showing more memory distortion, actually showing higher false memory recall if they are led to happy mood induced by the music. Also, when we feel happy, which is induced by the positive music, then we are more likely to see the forest. In terms of visual processing, means we are more likely to see the global picture. But when the participants when the sad mood is induced by using the sad music, then the participants pay more attention on the details, on the local processing. This one I like. The last ones, there is quite a few studies. So music-induced mood also showing to influence how we perceive space or the spatial perceptions there. For example, after listening to a positive music or after listening to a sad music, participants estimated a hill, an uphill, to be steeper as compared to the same hill appears less steep when they're feeling happy or when they're in a happy mood after listening to the happy music. Similarly, for example, downhill appears to be more riskier after listening to the fearful music. So this kind of gives you an overall idea about how mood, which is induced by the music, can influence our very low level, sometimes very low level, and to sometimes high level decision making. However, one has to be quite careful before making this forward. For example, there's often the researchers use the term mood and emotion quite interchangeably. However, they are not, because usually mood is induced after listening to a long musical excerpt where emotion is rather transient. So that's lead to the duration of the music. There is also a lot of variations with the different types of music used by the different researchers, and invariably there is a significant individual differences that we are still kind of grappling with or trying to understand. And also what are the potential neural mechanisms, the underlying kind of our knowledge is rather quite limited. So I'll give you, for the next few slides, very quickly, some of the studies done primarily at our labs to using reasonably controlled short musical excerpts. So in a sense, instead of trying to induce mood, rather trying to induce subtle, nuanced emotions, and then to see the impact of this changing or inducing a very transient emotions on different types of tasks. So in this domain, it was originally done by actually in 17 years back. So this is a very interesting study which shows that just after listening to a consonant or opposed to dissonance, the way we process words get influenced. So for example, after listening to a short consonant primes, people get faster processing positive valenced words. Similarly, when people were listening to, for example, dissonant primes, then they subsequently become much faster processing negative words. So there is a prime target congruency from the music to the semantic valence. Now the next question is, can musical emotion interact with or even influence not just the, for example, the language emotions or the emotional kind of valence expressed with the language, but emotional valence expressed visually. So this study we did quite a while back. So it's a very, very simple, straightforward study. The participant listened to short, very short 15-second instrumental emotional excerpts. There are no lyrics. They're all kind of realistic, already pre-validated musical excerpts. And then afterwards, a face was briefly flashed. Very simple task, simply read the facial emotion on a Likert scale, 1 to 7, as simple as that. And what we found that although this task is quite a very simple, the faces are presented for a reasonable period of time. It's a supra-threshold, quite salient stimuli. But interestingly, what we find that depending on what the music they have heard just before, that has significantly shifted the participants' rating of the facial emotions. So this actually showing the 3 different categories of facial emotions: happy, sad, and the neutral. So there is a systematic drop. So if the participant listened to the positive music just beforehand, then they give the same face slightly higher rating than when they listen to the sad music beforehand. And this impact of the musical prime on the visual emotional rating gets strongest when the face is emotionally neutral. So that's what quite interesting. When the emotion is ambiguous, then what the participants actually feel, that plays the strongest role. So this is showing the effect of the musical prime in terms of introducing the bias in the facial emotion judgment. And this bias is strongest when the facial emotion is neutral. So that shows that the valence from the musical prime is transferred to the judgment of valence of the facial emotion. So the musical valence is transferred cross-modally to influence the perception of facial emotions, and this transfer is maximal, as I said, for emotionally ambiguous targets. And we feel that it's very likely this is aligned with the effect as information account. So people, when they are faced with the neutral faces, which is emotionally ambiguous, they often use their cues that how do they feel about it? And this how do they feel about it, that's very much colored by what the musical excerpt they just heard beforehand, and that has subsequently quite systematic transfer to their visual judgment. But we just don't always, in terms of emotion, process the faces. We process emotions also in the complex natural stimuli. So then we did a follow-up study to see the impact of the musical emotions on the judgment of the visual emotions of a complex natural stimuli. And there we found quite interestingly, here we had a much more cautious approach. We tried to control for the musical primes in a much more systematic way. But just to cut the story short, what we found quite interestingly, that for the facial emotion, it is the musical valence, the valence dimension of the emotion that is transferred from music to the face. But when we process the complex images or natural stimulus, then this is the arousal dimension of the music that is transferred. So if the music is more stimulating, means highly arousal, then this arousal dimension also makes the arousal judgment of the subsequent visual stimuli higher. But it doesn't happen for the valence. So then there is because you can see here, the valence dimensions we do not find. So for the faces, emotions transferred across the valence dimension from the music to the visual. But for the complex natural stimuli, it is the arousal dimension that is transferred from the music to the visual dimension. And we also found that this effect is quite robust, replicated in a separate samples. So yes, in terms of cross-modal transfer of musical emotions, so this is, we found there is a diamond in transfer of the valence for faces, transfer of arousal for the images. But this still, when you talk about emotional processes, the processing of facial emotion, processing of a complex images are still reasonably quite in a high level decision making. But what about, can we talk about, can musical or emotions in the music can influence a rather low level perceptual decision making? So this is the study, we did it kind of a few years back. So task is reasonably simple. So this shows the schematic diagram of schematic kind of diagram of one trial. We first show one gray block to the participant, and we tell them, try to remember how gray it is. And then a brief musical excerpt was presented. Then they judge the arousal and the valence of the music. And then we present another gray square. And then you ask the participants, okay, which one do you think the second square, gray square, is it more brighter or darker? We tell them the cover story beforehand, yeah, we will present two gray squares, they will differ very slightly, you really have to pay attention. But in reality, we presented the same identical square. So what we found, that if the participants judged the in-between music as a more positive or happy, then they are more likely to judge the second gray square as brighter than the first gray square. So in a sense here we showed that the music that lead to a bias in terms of low level kind of brightness perception, which usually traditionally considered a low level. And then we found this degree of the bias that depends very much on how strong the participants find the music to be in terms of arousal and the valence. So there is a kind of linear increase. But then interestingly, okay, we ask ourselves, so yes, in between this trial, in between these two judgments, first and the second gray square, participants are evaluating a music in emotions, the emotional dimension, arousal and valence. But when you listen to the music, we do not always consciously judge, whether it is a positive, negative, high or low. We just listen to the music. So we ask, is this explicit evaluation, is it necessary? Or just listen to the music would be adequate enough to induce this bias? And we found actually, when we repeat the same experiment, but without having any explicit evaluation of the musical stimulus, and we also being very careful not to use the term emotion at all anywhere in the information sheet, but we found that removing this evaluation part actually makes the effect even stronger. That if the music that we used already pre-evaluated earlier to be positive or happy, then the participants, again like earlier, were judged the second square brighter than the previous or the first square. So again, we consider this transfer from the musical emotion to the brightness judgment rather implicit, because there is no explicit evaluation takes place of the musical emotion. Now one could think of, when we talk about this making a perceptual decision making, so we are participants here making a relative judgment. So whether the second square is higher or lower than the earlier one could think, we are somewhat eccentricking the participants, whether this is a kind of memory distortions or also a forced choice. So in order to go into further deeper into this process, that how much it is really caused, this kind of music led to the music induced brightness bias, it is really by the experimental design or by some explicit evaluations, then we did a further study where we actually removed the entire relative judgment aspect. So here what the participants did, first part for initially 10-15 minutes, they were learned a gray square. So where the complete black is 0, where the complete white is 100. So we stopped that they have to, they are being trained to remember this gray square. And once they have learned the gray square quite well, then what we did in the actual testing phase, they listened to one piece of music, very short, and then they are presented a gray square, and they are asked, tell me, in the previous scale, what should be the grayness value? So then there is no relative judgment, they're giving an absolute judgment there. And if the music indeed, or musical emotion indeed lead to the to the bias of the brightness judgment, then we expect or predict participants to give a higher value for the same gray square in the absolute terms as compared to the actual gray square in the earlier grayscale they actually learned. And indeed that we found, that's the case, that when the participant listen to a positive, happy music, then they're giving slightly, but still significantly higher gray values. So the same gray squares or the same squares are judged in absolute terms brighter there. So that gives you a kind of very nice kind of consistent findings that here the musical valence that modulate brightness perception, which is often considered quite a low level perceptual judgment. And also, as I said, these biases which we think by different manipulations are very likely to be implicit. And these results are very much also consistent from slightly, it's called the theory of metaphor representation. So often we associate the positive with the brighter, and negative and the darker, so that might play a role. And very quickly, just I will have to skip through these slides a bit quicker. We did the follow-up experiment that how this transfer from musical domain to visual domain, how much resource intensive it is. So in a sense of, does it require that we really have to actively listen to the music with all our attention to have this effect on our decision from the music to from any task? Actually, we found not really. So this is the experiment where we manipulated the working memory load. So the participants, they are trying to remember quite a long sequence while they're performing the earlier task. They listen to the music, they judge the emotional kind of rating of a face. We found that effect size get drastically reduced. Yes, the earlier we found there's effect size was much bigger. Here, loading the working memory means keeping or kind of limiting the resources for the music quite significantly. That impacted the effect size, but that doesn't obliterate. Still, there is a significant effect consistently, which is quite congruent from emotionally from the music to the visual prime. Just I thought to share some of the recent experiments we did, and especially in the context of the emotions, because at the very beginning, Marcus showed through his model that the kind of how expectancy, the jars or drives or emotions, and also Stefan showed very nicely how the expectancy, uncertainty, and surprise, their interaction that drives the musical pleasure. So we thought about to have to look into, so to manipulate the dimensions of expectancy and to see that immediate effect on our particular kind of task performance when there is this musically certain unexpected things happen, as opposed to when musically certain unexpected things happen. So very briefly, there are a bit of complicated experiments there. So participants listen to the music, the melodic sequence there. Again, using this, if you remember yesterday's Marcus's talk, you can compute the information content of individual note, and some melodic note would be highly expected, some melodic note would be highly unexpected, depending on the information content. And what we are doing while they're listening to this melodic excerpt, the faces, neutral faces, were presented in sync with each of the note. In one task block, there were participants who were asked to give just the approach rating, how much you like this neutral face. In another conditions, we asked the participants to memorize. We will memorize the faces that were being presented. We use an old new task. And the third one, we just ask how much you like this particular note. And what we find, interestingly, that those neutral phases that were presented in sync with the expected note, they were judged as more approachable as compared to the very similar phases if they are presented on an unexpected note. However, the participants' memory of these phases do not differ on whether they were presented on musically expected or musically unexpected note. So in a sense, there is an immediate transfer from the musical expectancy to the musical, because we also find that expected notes are, people also liked it. So there is an immediate transfer from the music to the approachability ratings, but not necessarily that makes a kind of higher memory rating. So those stimulus are not necessarily better coded or deep kind of coded and with a more depth, no. But at that moment, those phases or those stimuli were more preferred, which is again aligned with the musical valence as mediated by the expectancy. Did another recent follow-up studies. These are all, okay, I just included it. I thought to get your feedback as well, all unpublished findings. We found that also the participants, the judge, they are faster in processing a kind of processing the emotional valence of a words if they're congruent with the musical emotions at that moment, because there, instead of faces, we presented words. The words are different valence, positive or negative. The task is to judge just the valence. And we found that if the words, positive words, when they were coincided with the expected, they were processed faster, as opposed to the same positive words when they were presented in sync with an unexpected note. Okay, so what about the underlying, the neural mechanism? So there we are still learning much less compared to the much wider body of literature coming from the behavioral and the field studies. So this is just to very quickly show you some of the early findings our group published quite a few years back. The very similar study that we showed earlier, listen to the music, presenting a phase. Here we make sure the participants are not judging emotional phase. They're judging just to keep the emotion at the back bench. We didn't want the participants to use an emotional task at the foreground. They're just processing in neutral phases. And we found same phases are processed quite differently, depending on what the music they just heard beforehand. So this is showing you the changes of the spatial patterns. Very, very early stages changes, almost 50 milliseconds after the presentations of the neutral phase. That shows a very differences whether the participants listen to whether a positive music just beforehand as opposed to the negative music. And in terms of the event-related potentials, which is the ERP, we found there is a higher attentions, very early attentions. The same neutral phase gets more attentions at the very early stages of the neural information processing if they have just listened to the positive music just beforehand. And here we showed this is an effect of N1. Also, we have an effect in the P2. So this is a slightly later positive component there. And very, very recently, we wanted to test the very early predictions that I made, or early one of the theoretical account, if you remember, that by what mechanisms that the current emotions might influence our decision making, especially for an ambiguous stimuli. So here we did an EEG study and primarily look at what are the neural correlates when participants experiencing or reporting this music induced the bias in the brightness judgment there. So this is the third experiment. This is the EEG study of the third experiment, whether in the first phase participant learned the gray square, in the second phase, then they're giving an absolute judgment of the gray square. And we found quite interestingly, yes, behaviorally replicated the effect, and the EEG, so this on the right-hand side is showing the ERPs at the four different brain sites, 4 different scalp sites, and the lower one is showing the progressions of the event-related potentials over how they're distributed over the scalp, and you can see there are certain cross. So this cross showing formation of a clusters that after performing some careful statistical manipulation. So we see there is over the right auditory cortex areas at the very early stage, there is a cluster is being formed, and then slowly it expands to the also the higher kind of frontal areas at the later stages of the processing. And interestingly, when we try to find out where exactly in the brain, to a certain extent, I should not use the where exactly, but some ideas about where in the brain very likely these effects are located, we found that predominantly the two brain regions, they're showing most robust activations. The one is the right auditory cortex, and the second is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this ventromedial prefrontal cortex is also used or also introduced as the key brain regions which mediates the somatic marker hypothesis. So this is where that drives the bodily feelings and then finally influences our final decisions. So this very nicely shows that when our decisions about a very visual task is influenced by the music, then a certain key regions of the somatic marker hypothesis, key brain regions that do get activated along with auditory cortex. So the conclusions, hopefully I give you through a wide range of empirical findings that the emotional dimensions of the music, even using short music stimulus, can be transferred to non-music related processes. And these transfers will have a consequence in the different types of decision processes, and very likely these transfer effects are mostly implicit, means happening under the level of our conscious awareness. However, there are very many open issues, because so far we, here in this talk, as well as most of the researchers, we use a very oversimplified kind of model of musical emotions. We only consider two-dimensional or maximum three-dimensional models, okay, arousal, valence, and there has been more studies recently coming out that the musical emotions are much more complex, and often there is this arousal and valence could be considered a higher construct. And also most studies, especially at least in this domain, are done in the laboratory, at least when you use a more of a controlled stimulus or on the neuroimaging, they're done in the laboratory. Field experiments are rather rare. We also know much less on the longitudinal aspects there. Cross-cultural, we touched quite a bit over actually from yesterday, but how this transfer effect depend on the cross-cultural aspect from one culture to another, also we know very little. And the last ones, which is the contextual effects of music. In what context do we listen to the music? There, what is our beforehand our expectations while we listen to the music? That has rarely been studied, and that's in a sense would be quite interesting. For example, if you're listening to the music in a banal setting at an inconvenient time, would you really still experience or have the musical this intense aesthetical experience or intense emotional experience? Very likely not. So I'm not playing the videos. I can see Andrea's face already because my time is up. So this is just to give you, if you have a time. So this was a kind of video from a very famous, one of the top level violinists playing at a New York Central Station subway, and rarely people paying any attention, while same individuals would pay hundreds of dollars to go to his concert. So that to some extent suggests that how important this importance of context. And finally, although I am here presenting the results, I'm the face, but the other people's, to be honest, they did all the hard work. I'm, to be honest, taking primarily the credit. So thanks to all my students and as well as collaborators, and also thanks to you. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Joy. Very interesting. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and they're coming in, so I have to divide my attention here. One of the simple questions, perhaps, maybe simple or not to answer, one questioner, one of your fellow panelists, asked whether we've talked about valence and arousal. And one of the things that this person thought of was, has anyone looked at loudness level, which
yes, okay, we ourselves looked at it there. So, I mean, the loudness is quite an interesting concept as well. So what are the acoustical parameters that could drive some of the effects? And there has been quite a body of literature, which is, if you go into another related domain called cross-modal correspondence. So when particular one attributes or one sensory stimuli, how they are mapped to another sensory attributes. And for example, music and color is quite widely studied. Loudness as well. We ourselves looked at it in these music and brightness studies, because naturally the reviewer wanted to ask, is there any difference in the acoustical brightness? Is there difference in the pitch there? The short answer is yes, people have looked at it. Long answer is, or answer is yes, there are certain trend, yes, something which is acoustically more bright, they are more perceived to be conveying positive emotions there. So that is a immediate kind of short answer. Long answer is, like any science, it's a complicated there. And the loudness itself also varying with time there. So perceived loudness and acoustical brightness, that also determines, okay, varies with time. And that itself, another interesting aspect, this temporal dynamics of the music and its potential interactions with very many different types of tasks, or the way we interact in the environment, and how this temporal dynamics of the music, which is loudness, you can consider spectral flux, the different, very many different types of musical parameters you can talk about, how they interact, that is definitely, as to my understanding, not yet adequately studied.
And just a comment, don't feel bad about not finding memorability effects on the faces. It makes me feel better because I tried it with music and paintings that were matched or mismatched in valence. And it did not affect the memory of either the music or the paintings, whether they were congruent or non-congruent. So we can talk more about that.
Thank you very much. And actually, when we did the experiment, memory we added later, because I was initially thinking, if we find an effect from the musical emotion induced by musical expectancy to a pleasure rating or approachability rating, so is it mediated by the processing fluency? So whether if we process the stimuli more fluent because at that moment certain event is more expected, and if this transfer is mediated by processing fluency, then also you expect that the participants' memory of that event would be better. But we didn't find. So that from that cases, so we could eliminate the processing fluency account.
Yeah, so it's sort of sad. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to collapse them. And they kind of revolve around, I guess, the metacognitive level. That is referring to the implicit and explicit studies that you were talking about, and putting some of these questions together. Do you think there's another layer of sort of processes going on where when people might be somewhat aware of these potential effects and therefore mitigate against them?
Well, that's a second order. It's okay. It's the answer. I can tell you it could be, maybe. However, okay. I mean, again, I have to be quite careful because the whole day can be spent talking on this differentiation between explicit and implicit, and I am quite mindful about making those distinction as clear as possible. Only from the neural point of view, we can say that if an effect is happening at the early stages, it might have a certain indication. However, again, at the same breath, I have to tell you that that is not an unequivocal signature of implicit processing, because there has been in the neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, there has been a considerable body of evidence shows that how we anticipate or expect even before a stimulus appears, that would already influence how we process the stimulus. So the thing is, you're right, who raised the question is also right. because it is quite tricky to have a very clear-cut distinction between implicit and explicit process. Rather, I would rather say that these distinctions, whatever way I have presented, it's a more on a very explicit conscious verbal awareness level, rather put it like that. So, but otherwise, it is very difficult to distinguish. And as you say, that you can always add another order.
Yeah, I love orders. I had a couple of questions that, again, I'm going to combine that sort of switches the equation around. So one person had asked whether, going back to the individual differences point, whether the strength of some of the effects that we're talking about could actually be viewed as some kind of index of how fluent an emotional processor you are. And a second individual actually also puts that in the context of people like those with on the autism spectrum or other sort of emotional disfluencies, whether some of what you're talking about could actually be an index of individual difference of success in processing emotion.
Yeah, good point, very good questions. Okay, there are certain studies using the paradigm that I introduced, okay, has been used by other researchers using in Williams syndromes as well as Fragile X syndrome to look for crossmodal effect. They did find crossmodal effect. A similar aspect or kind of relative this crossmodal correspondence or the sound symbolism, that the certain sound is related to a certain shape. There are certain evidence by cross-cultural there. However, again, it's not very clear-cut. And even our own laboratory findings as well, when you try to go a little bit more details about, for example, you mentioned autism spectrum, we found the effect is a bit more complicated if you want to just looking into simple standard trait measures of AQ. So there are other measures, for example, we found are more relevant, for example, alexithymia. So how we are more emotional recognitions. So again, the answer is we know very little about how individual differences might mitigate or whether this could be used as a kind of a rating for individuals' processing of emotions. Yes, could be there. Definitely we do need more studies, of course, okay, there, because this kind of cross-modal transfer and impact of individual differences in cross-modal transfer is almost, literature is non-existent almost there. However, I'm just telling you the individual difference studies are always fraught with difficulties there. So it's an interesting avenues to research, but as I said, we ourselves tried to look into a little bit carefully using the AQ spectrum. There we found just the AQ spectrum itself, just using as AQ variant trait, is not a very clear cut. But things get interesting when you also use the alexithymia trait.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting. And in the 30 seconds we have left, one perhaps with a slightly cynical question, not sure, anonymous.
Good, I like the cynical questions. Yes, I'm a cynical person. No.
On these consumer research studies, does music not just affect what you buy, but how much you buy?
Yes, okay, that's I mentioned to you very briefly, not in the purchase. I'm sure possibly they used how much you buy, but I mentioned this one particular study that how much you left as a tip.
Yes.
There they showed, yes, there's the same environment, just depending on the background music, participants left more tips.
Well, if that makes someone else happy, I think the question was asking about making him or herself happy, but we will leave it at that. I think we have to do the switch over. So thank you very much. Applause.
Thanks to you guys, and thanks to everyone who raised the questions. Thank you.
And we'll get the questions to you, and I turn things back to our host.
Thank you.